Good morning. I'm delighted to be able to address you today, and I want to particularly thank Larry Allen for inviting me. Since I've gotten to the Senate, I've been hammering away at government contracting, and I tend to come at it from the perspective of an auditor and a prosecutor, because that's my background. And that means that I focus on the unfortunate instances of waste, fraud, and abuse involving some of our government contracts. 2 years ago, we formed the subcommittee on contracting oversight to bring new attention to this mission. As chairman, we have held more than a dozen hearings addressing everything from federal databases to Medicare contracts to the recent horrible events at Arlington National Cemetery. The reality is that today federal contracting is just how the government does business, and that isn't going to change anytime soon. That's why it's so important to ensure that the contracting process is as efficient, transparent, and accountable as possible. I know that addressing the problems with government contracting isn't going to be easy. It's going to require dogged oversight by Congress and fundamental reforms in the contracting process, and I'm committed to both of these. But this subcommittee is a step in the right direction. We plan to continue to hold hearings on contracting in the subcommittee through the end of this year and beyond. We also plan to continue our work on contracts for congressional earmarks, contract audits, and the use of contractors to respond to Congress. I've also asked my staff to begin investigations of the Department of Energy and on the federal government's use of public relations contracts. I will also continue to push legislation to address some of the abuses in federal contracting. To start with, when the Senate comes back into session, I plan to introduce a bill to end the unfair preferences given to Alaska Native corporations. Some of you may have seen the recent Washington Post series on this issue. But last year, the subcommittee did their own investigation. I held a hearing in the subcommittee, and unfortunately, we heard about the special preferences and loopholes for ANCs, and the government's disturbing lack of oversight of the program has resulted in a program that doesn't benefit the taxpayer or the Alaskans themselves. The government and the taxpayers don't get competition, and the Alaskans get only a few $100s a year on average from billions and billions of dollars in contracts. Ultimately, after the hearing, the Senate Armed Services Committee did pass a law requiring that the federal agencies justify and approve sole source contracts of more than $20 million to ANCs. But the legislation I'm introducing now goes much further. It will require an Alaska Native corporations to play by the same rules as other 8A companies. But you and I both know that all the hearings and legislation in the world won't crack down on waste, fraud, and abuse unless there are enough government acquisition officials, contract managers, program managers, and auditors to adequately oversee these contracts. That's why I'm working with Senator Collins and several of my colleagues in the Senate to improve recruitment and training of the acquisition workforce. This will be a good start, but these efforts are also not enough. Reform legislation frequently gets bogged down in Congress, even in the rare circumstances where all the stakeholders agree that changes are necessary. To achieve real reforms, we need government contractors to join the process. I frequently hear from companies that they feel that all the blame for the problems with government contracting is being laid at their doorsteps. I don't think anyone could watch the hearings I've held in the subcommittee this year and think that I'm letting the government off the hook for their mistakes. But at the same time, government contractors have a real responsibility to ensure that the government is getting the best possible bang for its buck. I want to recognize that groups like Acquisition Reform Working Group, of which the coalition is part, are playing an important role in advancing the dialogue about important reforms in government contracting. But as you know, there's more to be done. Too often, government contractors as a whole are tarred with the same brush as the relatively few bad actors. It doesn't take more than a couple of stories about overcharges, shoddy workmanship, and outright bribes for the public and the press to assume that all contractors are cheating the government. You and I both know that's not true, and you can help change that perception by participating in the larger discussions about how to make the system as a whole work better. I hope you'll consider speaking out against some of the abuses from which you may sometimes profit. For example, privately, I'm sure many of you would agree that the practice of some of your colleagues of using the ANCs, the Alaska Native corporations, as pass-throughs to obtain sole source contracts is not in the best interest of the government. and that it blackens the name of those companies who are caught abusing the loopholes. You can help us end this shameful practice forever, so I hope you'll join me in calling for more reforms. You know better than most that a handful of bad actors can hurt the system. So I encourage you to let me or my colleagues know where real problems are and what changes in law or policy are necessary to improve government contracting for the government, the taxpayers, and the contractors. Sometimes these changes will mean a better deal from your company. Sometimes it'll mean a better deal for the taxpayers. And those two goals are not necessarily exclusive. After all, you're taxpayers too. But in the end, it will lead to a better system for everyone. Thanks so much for allowing me to speak with you for a few minutes today. I wish I could have been there in person, but I look forward to working with you in the future. Thanks.